Joining me now is Ambassador Herman Cohen, a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs from 1989 to 1993 and former professional lecturer at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He joins me now from Washington, D.C. Ambassador Cohen, thank you for joining us on the program.
Very pleased to be with you.
How would you describe U.S.-China relations right now, considering that China was one of the many targets of President Joe Biden's first address on foreign policy when he assumed office?
Well, I would say U.S.-China relations are kind of tense right now. The U.S. press is full of stories about the Chinese ethnic group called the Uyghurs, who live in Western China, and apparently they're being very badly treated. They're in forced labor camps. There is sterilization of women. The Chinese apparently are engaged in ethnic cleansing. The U.S. Secretary of State actually used that term the other day, ethnic cleansing. Also, in the South China Sea, the Chinese are trying to exclude all other nations from using the South China Sea. They claim jurisdiction between China and the Philippines. They're trying to keep the U.S. Navy out of the South China Sea. And also there is what they call cultural stealing of our cultural goods. Our companies are there and they take all of the company secrets. So generally, we're not getting along well with the Chinese right now.
And we're also seeing, as you rightly mentioned, some of the same issues raised by former President Donald Trump, which are cyber attacks on the United States, economic coercion of allies. How do you think the Biden administration can approach these differently from the previous administration?
Well, President Trump had a policy of America first. He said, let's look inward. Let's work for the American people instead of working for all those foreigners. So he loosened ties with NATO, which is our primary international security organization. He says we're going to pull troops out of Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria. He was more of an isolationist, whereas Biden says, look, there are a lot of problems out there. We could contribute. Now, Biden also says we don't want to be in endless wars. So he also wants to leave Afghanistan and Iraq and that sort of thing. But I think the key difference between Biden and Trump is the NATO relationship. Trump was criticizing the Europeans, saying they're not putting enough money into defense. We, the Americans, are supporting all of their defense needs. Whereas Biden is more cooperative. He says the Europeans are our most important allies. Let's work with them. So there was a distinct difference between Trump and Biden.
Now, to that meeting that Secretary of State Antony Blinken had with his Chinese counterparts in Alaska, the Chinese left quite dissatisfied from that meeting. They felt the U.S. government was only called the meeting to just, read the riot act to them without giving them an opportunity to really defend themselves or to address the real issues between them. What do you make of the meeting?
Well, it wasn't necessarily a disaster. I think Secretary Blinken had to make a public statement because the U.S. public was so enraged about the treatment, as I mentioned before, of the Uyghurs, the ethnic cleansing. So he had to make that public statement. Usually diplomats don't do that. They do everything, quietly. But he made the public, and of course the Chinese had to respond in public. They said, well, look at you, you had slavery, you had all, so it was a kind of a nasty public exchange. But I'm sure that when they stopped talking in public and talked to each other, they were able to talk about areas where they cooperate. And I think the key thing for the Biden administration in China is climate change. China is probably the worst polluter in the world right now. They keep building coal plants, which is really ridiculous. But I think we can work together with them to do something about climate change. And I'm sure that's what they talk about behind the scenes in non-public statements.
I kind of think maybe the U.S. is jealous of China. I mean, China has matched American intelligence as well as, developments and so on. The U.S. apparently seems to be trying to stop China's influence somehow, especially as concerns Africa. There's been continuous, advice to African leaders about China's soft power, taking over resources, teaming up with allies against the United States and other Western countries. Do you also share this view?
Not necessarily. You know, China has been expanding economically for at least 20 years now, and they need commodities. And Africa has commodities that China doesn't have. For example, cobalt, columbium, tantalum, copper. There are all sorts of, even a lot of iron ore. So the Chinese have been making deals with African countries. Look, you give us a guaranteed supply of crude oil, say 200,000 barrels a day, and we will do infrastructure for you. We will send Chinese corporations, Chinese government-owned corporations will do infrastructure, and we'll give you soft loans and that sort of thing. And in general, it's been a mixed bag. Some of the work they've done has been good. Some of the work they've done is not so good. U.S. companies are now getting contracts to repair some of the shoddy work done by Chinese. And we don't see Chinese as using their influence for political gain. They're mainly interested in bartering trade for infrastructure. Also, they've been giving soft loans, and these loans have been piling up. So a lot of African countries are deeply in debt to China, and this is causing them a lot of economic stress. And there's another bad thing that the Chinese are doing. When they bring in Chinese workers, say 10% of the workforce, after they finish their work, the Chinese workers stay behind, and they set up retail, and they start importing Chinese goods. That does bad things for the local enterprises. Look at Kano, Nigeria. It used to be a major industrial city, but because of Chinese imports, most of Kano's industries have gone downhill. And also another thing that the Chinese do that's bad, when they hire African people to work for them, they don't promote them. They don't train them for managerial positions. If you go to Chevron, which is in Nigeria, it's in Angola. If you go to Chevron Angola and you say, I want to meet the head of your company in Angola, and you go in there and it's a Nigerian. He's got a career with Chevron for 35 years. American companies promote Africans into managerial positions. They train them. Chinese never do that.
But China recently celebrated its eradication of poverty. And according to the government, they are also exporting some of the strategies that they have used. And I'm suspecting that some of the strategies have been exported to Africa. They claim they also want to help other countries to get out of poverty. Do you believe they're also doing this, out of a clear conscience, or there really is something else, another motive pushing China to do this? And what do you think that motive is?
Well, they want political support. For example, the Africans have most of the votes in the United Nations. So when there are resolutions which are opposed to China, which are criticizing China, they want the Africans to vote against those resolutions. And they also want to vote in favor of Chinese resolutions. So there is a political motive there. But I think for the most part, the Chinese want to make money, and they want to have economic development, and they see Africa as a great source of commodities. What they're not doing, in my view, is really promoting African development. Some of it, what they're doing is helpful, infrastructure, they're building roads and dams. And as I said before, not all the work is very good. For example, in the Congo, the road from Kinshasa, the capital, to Matadi, the port, used to take 6 hours because the road was very bad. The Chinese built a new road, and it reduced the time to two hours by road. But within 3 years, the road was gone. It was washed out by the tropical rains. So China is a mixed bag, and some of it is good and some of it is bad. And I think it's up to the Africans to manage the Chinese.
And what can African countries do to manage, this relationship with China and the United States and other Western countries, seeing that at the end of the day, well, it appears everybody wants the same thing, which is access to, markets, access to investments, and so on.
Well, the Africans should pass laws or regulations saying, look, workers workers should be treated much better. They should get a lunch break. The Chinese don't want to give them a lunch break. They want to have time to go to the bathroom. Chinese don't let them go to the bathroom. I had a student at Johns Hopkins once, and she spent the summer in Africa studying China. And when she came back, I said, well, what did you find? She said, well, I went to one Chinese company. And I said, why do you treat these African workers so badly? And they said, well, no, we're treating them just like we treat Chinese workers in China. You see? So the Africans have to say, look, you treat your workers better. You give them all sorts of privileges and benefits and lunch breaks and bathroom breaks and that sort of thing. Stop treating them like you treat Chinese. And also, they should have better salaries. They should have a minimum wage. The Africans seem to be very soft on Chinese business in Africa. They should regulate them more and have higher standards for African workers.
Yeah, it kind of seems like a contrast, with the Chinese government saying they have eradicated poverty, and they probably have, different indices for measuring that. But I want to talk now about President Vladimir Putin and the verbal attack by U.S. President Joe Biden on the Russian president when he called him a snake. There is some history there. The United States still thinks Russia tried to interfere with America's election back in 2016. And according to intelligence reports recently, it did again in the 2020 elections. Do you believe America's elections have always been under threat of Russian interference and other allied forces?
Well, just I think last week, when President Biden was being interviewed by a journalist, a day before that interview, the U.S. intelligence community produced an unclassified report giving details of how the Russians try to interfere in our elections. Their objective was to have President Trump reelected because Trump has been so friendly to Putin and refusing to criticize anything they do. And the Russians did this with cyber methods and using social media, promoting Trump as a good man and Biden as a bad man. It didn't really impact too much on American voters, but it got Biden very angry. So just a day after that report came out, the journalist asked the question to Biden, do you think Putin is a killer? And Biden said, yes. Now, of course, he shouldn't have said that. This is not good diplomacy if you want to have good relations with Russia. But he was so angry that the Russians twice tried to defeat the Democratic candidate. And Hillary Clinton was defeated. I don't think she was defeated because of Russia, but they made a conscious effort to defeat the American candidates in favor of Trump. So Biden misspoke when he said that, but it's clear that because of their cyber warfare against the United States in many respects, that Biden is very, very angry at the Russians right now.
President Putin does welcome the idea of him and President Biden sitting to discuss. He said that during one of the press conferences last week. You think that will ever happen, President Biden and President Putin? I know that former President Donald Trump had a better relationship with the Russian president, but do you ever see these two sitting for a coffee or tea?
I think there's going to have to be a lot of diplomacy at lower levels first. I think maybe Secretary Blinken will have to go and talk to his counterpart in Moscow and start building up slowly, because there are many common interests between us and the Russians. There is climate change, there is the Ukraine problem, there is the Far East problem. I think there are many things we can talk about, but it'll have to be done slowly and starting from lower levels before Biden can get involved again. I think it'll take about another year before that happens.
Ambassador Herman Cohen, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for making the time to speak with us on Diplomatic Channel.
You're most welcome. I enjoyed it. Thank you.